This episode contains discussions of suspected sexual abuse. If that's not something you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so, the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to discuss a famous allegation of murder. The mystery and brutal nature of this story have fascinated me for a long time, which is why I chose it for the first episode of the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. Without further ado, let's begin. The day was hot in the small town of Fall River, Massachusetts. It was August 4th, 1892, and the social climate of Fall River was on a downhill slope. The streets were full of horses and the river full of raw sewage. In the 100-degree Fahrenheit weather, the stink must have been unbearable. The aristocracy of the city lived in an area known as the Hill, which sat high above the rest of the city, while the less fortunate lived closer to the stinking river. Business was beginning to turn sour, and financial tensions were running high. In February of that year, a man was shot 5 times by his son during an argument over money. Weavers in some of the textile mills that served as the main industry of the city were not allowed to speak during their shifts, possibly to prevent the formation of unions. Not only was money short, but the local police were enforcing strict regulations on the sale of alcohol, thanks to the slowly building temperance movement. This made it hard for people to drink their rising sorrows away. Without alcohol, people turned to other, more violent forms of entertainment. Rat baiting was on the rise, a blood sport that involved putting terriers into pits with rats and seeing how fast the dog killed them. Cockfights to the death were also growing in popularity. This was the environment in which our story takes place. That morning, around 9:30 a.m., Bridget Sullivan, an Irish immigrant working as a maid for the Borden family, was cleaning the windows of her employer's home on 92 2nd Street. She hadn't been feeling well since breakfast and had even vomited. None of the family was well, in fact, the heads of the family having been up most of the night before, vomiting. This was possibly due to a meal of mutton that had gone off, but was consumed anyway to avoid the purchase of more meat. While she washed the windows from the outside, touting water back and forth from the barn, Bridget could see her employer's 32-year-old daughter Lizzie sitting out on the porch in the shade. Completing her work outside, Bridget moved indoors to clean the windows from the inside. This work had been requested that morning by her employer's wife, Abby. After a few moments, Lizzie approached Bridget. Both Lizzie and her older sister Emma, and possibly the whole family, tended to call Bridget Maggie, which was the name of the previous maid, either out of laziness or disdain. There was quite a bit of anti-Irish and anti-immigrant sentiment at this time in Fall River, despite the textile mills being powered by their labor. Lizzie told Bridget that there was a dress sale happening in town. Bridget was interested, and Lizzie encouraged her to go. However, Bridget was not yet finished with the windows, so Lizzie left her to her work. Sometime later, there was a knock on the door. Andrew Jackson Borden, Bridget's employer and Lizzie's father, had returned from his business in town. Bridget unlocked the 3 locks on the door to let him into the house. Mr. Borden required all doors to be locked, inside and out, at all times. He even kept his own bedroom locked. As she opened the door, Bridget heard a laugh from upstairs. Moments later, Lizzie appeared and greeted her father. Bridget overheard Lizzie mention that Abby had received a note and went to visit a sick friend. Mr. Borden, also feeling unwell after days of bad mutton and a stressful morning at the bank, retired to the lounge for a nap on the sofa. Her window washing done and still feeling a bit ill herself, Bridget left for her own room in the attic to do the same. It was about 11 a.m. Some time later, possibly only 15 minutes later, Bridget awoke to the sound of screams. Lizzie was calling to her from the lounge. When Bridget entered the room, she was horrified. Blood was pouring out of 10 deep gashes on Mr. Borden's face. The floor beneath where he lay was soaked with it. Red was spattered across the walls, the sofa he lay on, a painting above it, and across the ceiling. A detail that stuck with Bridget and many who viewed the scene after her was that one of Mr. Borden's eyes had been struck cleanly in two. Lizzie sent Bridget for the family physician, Dr. Bowen, who lived across the street. Bridget pounded on the door, but there was no response. Not knowing what else to do, she returned home. Lizzie then sent her for a neighbor and close family friend, Alice Russell, who in turn sent for the police. Another neighbor, Adelaide Churchill, also came over after seeing Lizzie looking distressed at the side door of the house. Both women asked where Abby was, and Lizzie again mentioned the note from a sick friend. By the time the police arrived, a crowd had formed outside the house. When asked where her mother was, Lizzie replied that Abby was her stepmother. She told the police her real mother had died when she was a child. This calm correction sparked suspicion. Lizzie then described the note, but also mentioned that she thought she'd heard Abby come in, and that the last time she had seen her stepmother was in the guest bedroom, changing the sheets after John Morse, Lizzie's maternal uncle who had stayed the night, had left the house with Mr. Borden that morning. Together, Adelaide and Bridget went upstairs to search for Abby. From the landing, a second horrible sight met their eyes. Abby Borden was face down on the floor of the guest bedroom, the back of her head completely caved in. The pillow sham in her hands, her clothes, the walls, and the chair next to her were spattered in blood. Her long braid, hacked off in the violence of the attack, lay beside her. Over the next few days, the police and close family friends went in and out of the house, collecting evidence and asking questions. Lizzie's older sister Emma returned from Fairhaven, where she had been visiting friends, to find her home in mourning. Protective of her younger sister and desperate for answers, Emma proposed a $5,000 reward for anyone with information about the murders. No one came forward. The police searched the house, including all of the bedrooms and even the pit toilet in the basement. Forensic analysis, which was still a new science at the time, was applied to the scene of the murders. It was determined that the weapon used against Mr. Borden was likely a hatchet. The pattern of the blood spatter on the walls also indicated that the weapon had broken during the carnage, the hatchet head separating from the handle. A hatchet missing its handle was found in the basement, but it was not collected until a few days later. One police officer said that the handle was found next to the hatchet head. Another said the handle was never found. Either way, there was no mention of blood being found on the hatchet. It was, however, noted that ash had been scattered over it, as if in an attempt to resemble dust. Lizzie and Emma's rooms were inspected, but not thoroughly. A navy blue dress, supposedly the one that Lizzie had worn that day, was collected. There was some question later as to if this really was the dress she had worn, but she insisted it was. Throughout the entire investigation, Lizzie remained calm and detached. It soon came to light that Lizzie and Bridget were the only people in the house when Abby and Andrew were murdered. There was a small time frame between breakfast and the time Lizzie had been seen on the porch by Bridget. The note Lizzie had mentioned was nowhere to be found, and no friends claimed to have sent any such note to Abby. On top of this, Lizzie seemed fairly unaffected by the brutal murders and held that she had never got on well with her stepmother. It was well known in Fall River that Andrew Borden was not well liked. At the time of his death, his net worth was around $10 million in today's money, a fact that Lizzie claimed she was unaware of. Despite this wealth, he was frugal to a fault. While the town and the rest of the state were suffering an economic downturn, he was blossoming, becoming the head of one of the town's largest banks. He also owned a fair amount of property, renting apartments to the people who worked in his textile mills. He was so miserly that when he gave his workers a wage increase, he also raised their rent. In this way, Mr. Borden made many enemies, and some residents believed Abby and Andrew were killed for this reason. Andrew Borden's miserliness extended to his own family. He refused to pay for indoor plumbing in his own house, and instead of living in the wealthy part of town, an area he could definitely afford, he chose to live near his textile factories in a house that had been cheaply converted from a duplex to a single-family home, which he kept locked at all times. Lizzie and Emma had been constantly restricted in their purchasing. Their complaints about this lack of expenditure had been heard by many of their friends on several occasions. Because of her cold and also erratic behavior after the murders, and the fact that she and her sister would benefit financially from the death of their father, police suspicion turned toward Lizzie. Even though they had no murder weapon and no blood had been found on Lizzie's clothing, the police believed that she was the murderer. When Alice Russell came forward to say that she had seen Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen just days after the murder, it seemed their suspicions had been confirmed. Before we discuss the inquest and the trial of Lizzie Borden, an ad must play. If you find these ads annoying, you can gain access to ad-free episodes of the Morbid Curiosity podcast by becoming a patron on Patreon for as little as $2 a month. On August 8th, an inquest was held in which Lizzie Borden was brought in to testify without her family attorney, despite having requested his presence. This is the only time Lizzie spoke about the murder of her father and stepmother, as she was not compelled to testify at her trial and never spoke publicly about the murders afterwards. Unfortunately, Volume 1 of Lizzie's inquest testimony has been lost, but it was mostly reproduced in a newspaper, the Evening Standard of New Bedford, Massachusetts, on June 12, 1893. It should be noted, however, that newspapers at this time were more akin to tabloids than real journalism, so it's not known how accurate the reprinted inquest transcript is. Lizzie's answers were erratic, sometimes off-topic, and generally all over the place. On several occasions, she declined to answer, or stated that she did not know how to answer. She contradicted herself, at one time saying she'd been ironing during the time of her father's murder, and another time saying she'd been in the barn searching for lead sinkers for a fishing trip she had planned and eating pears. When questioned about the burning of her dress, she claimed it had been stained with paint and she was only disposing of it. She also remained adamant that she and her stepmother didn't get along, and revealed that both she and her sister referred to Abby as Mrs. Borden instead of Mother. On August 11th, after 3 days of questioning, Lizzie Borden was arrested and imprisoned at Taunton Jail. There she would await trial for around a year. At first, the town of Fall River supported Lizzie, saying a well-bred woman who taught Sunday school, was part of the temperance movement, and associated with others of high society, could never commit such ghastly murders. At the time, women were considered the weaker sex, incapable of even conceiving of such a ghastly act. But Lizzie's lack of feeling during the inquest and her cold demeanor toward her mother soon became known, and her innocence fell into doubt. Through police investigation, it came to light that Lizzie had been accused of shoplifting on more than one occasion. Her father had paid quite a bit to keep these incidents quiet. A pharmacist came forward and said that the day before the murder, Lizzie had come to him for prussic acid, what we know today as cyanide, with the pretense of cleaning something with it. Though he hadn't sold it to her, her attempt to purchase it did nothing to quell suspicion. Evidence of tension in the Borden house began to mount as the police tried to put together a case substantial enough for trial by grand jury. Dr. Bowen reported that Abby had come to him the day before the murder, frightened that the illness she and her husband suffered might be due to poisoning. Apparently, a man had come to the house sometime the previous week and had had a disagreement with Andrew Borden, and Abby had worried that this man may have wanted revenge. When questioned about Lizzie's relationship with her stepmother, Bridget Sullivan told the police that at first the two women appeared cordial, but that neither Emma nor Lizzie tended to eat their meals with their parents. It was also revealed that when Abby had wanted to make a pigeon pie a few months before the murder, Mr. Borden had killed a flock of pigeons that he kept in the family barn. Lizzie had considered these birds her pets and was extremely upset. A family argument in June had prompted both sisters to take extended vacations away from their parents, from which Lizzie returned early, only a week before the murders. Soon, the newspaper was printing all sorts of wild and unfounded rumors. One of these was that Lizzie had been pregnant, leading to a conflict with her parents. This particular story came from the imagination of a detective who was paid $1,000 for also handing over witness statements to reporters. The reporter who paid him was quickly indicted for tampering with witnesses. A local sheriff hid himself under Lizzie's bed in prison to listen in on her visits. His testimonies were immediately dismissed as they risked the jury's indignation for such ungentlemanly conduct. Lizzie's trial in front of a grand jury took place on June 5, 1893, more than a year after the murders had taken place. Lizzie had remained in jail, treated as guilty before her trial had even begun. It was because of this malpractice of the law that the judge threw out Lizzie's testimony from the inquest. His reasoning was that the testimony had been given under duress and without the requested attorney. The pharmacist's testimony about the prussic acid was also thrown out because it was judged to be too remote in the time frame to have any connection with the murders. Without her erratic behavior as evidence, and no blood or murder weapon, the only evidence against Lizzie Borden was a witness account of her burning a dress and her presence in the house at the time. Bridget testified at the trial. According to her statement, Abby had last been seen at breakfast. Bridget went upstairs after finishing the windows at around 10:58 a.m. and left Lizzie and her father downstairs. Andrew Borden's blood was still wet when Lizzie called Bridget down, whereas Abby's had begun to coagulate when Bridget discovered her. That meant that Abby had been killed first, possibly hours before Andrew. A neighbor testified that he saw Bridget cleaning the windows during the estimated time of Abby's death, and then saw Lizzie leaving the barn at 11:03 a.m., just as she had stated in her previous testimony. Another neighbor confirmed the time, as Lizzie was seen walking to the house from the barn. Lizzie had called to Bridget at around 11:10 a.m., leaving only around 7 minutes in which she could have murdered her father and cleaned herself and the murder weapon of blood in a house without indoor plumbing. In 1975, a theory arose that if Lizzie had committed the murders in the nude, she may have been able to clean herself up after killing both Abby and her father. This would of course mean she had planned their murders very carefully, as many things would have had to be in place for this to work, such as well-placed washing buckets, ways to keep blood from dripping off her body as she cleaned herself, and a clandestine way of disposing of the bloodied water. Because of the illness that had struck the Borden household just before the murders, the milk from the family's kitchen and the contents of Andrew and Abby's stomachs were tested for poison. None was found. Both Mr. and Mrs. Borden's heads were also removed during the autopsy, and the skulls were used as evidence during the trial. When the skulls were revealed, Lizzie fainted. The skulls were later buried at the foot of Mr. and Mrs. Borden's graves. As the trial was nearing its end, the only evidence that Lizzie Borden had murdered her father and stepmother was her presence in the house at the time of the murders. For a killing this bloody, there was a severe lack of blood found on Lizzie or anywhere else in the house. On June 20th, after deliberating for only an hour and a half, the jury moved to acquit Lizzie Borden. No one else was ever formally accused. A similar axe murder occurred in Fall River between the time of the Borden murders and the trial. This might have removed suspicion from Lizzie during that time frame, but the perpetrator of the other murder was proven to be out of the country when the Bordens were killed, renewing suspicion against Lizzie. The people of Fall River didn't believe Lizzie was innocent. Even without the many rumors printed in the papers, her behavior seemed too cool and calm, and with no other suspects, she seemed to be the only one who could have done it. Lizzie was publicly shunned by the community. The famous rhyme, "Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41, came into being not long after the incident occurred. No one knows who came up with the rhyme, but some believe the newspapers began printing it to sell papers, while others point to the children of Fall River, who sang it while skipping rope. After the trial was over, Lizzie changed her name to Lizbeth, and she and Emma bought a stately home called Maplecroft near the top of the hill. The house, with its 14 rooms, was nothing like the cramped converted duplex they had lived in with their parents. In 1905, the sisters had a falling out, and Emma left. They remained estranged for the rest of their lives. Despite this separation, the Borden sisters died within days of each other in 1927. No one attended, nor was invited, to Lizzie's funeral. When the barn was torn down at the house on 2nd Street, the remains of the building were carefully sifted through, looking for clues, such as the bloody hatchet, or perhaps a blood-covered apron or dress. Nothing was found. The house, which today has been restored to its 1892 state and serves as a bed and breakfast, is often full of dark tourists hoping to find a clue that will prove once and for all who killed Andrew and Abby Borden. Did Lizzie Borden escape justice? Did she kill her father and stepmother and get away with it? There seems at first to be no other logical explanation. She was in the house at the time of the murders. Her account of her whereabouts that day doesn't add up. She burned a dress in the presence of witnesses, claiming it had paint on it, and she was said to be cold and unfeeling during her trial. These don't seem like the behaviors of an innocent person. If she did kill them, why? Perhaps Lizzie grew so frustrated by being part of the upper class and still unable to live an upper-class lifestyle that she snapped. Trying to be, quote, normal, unquote, or keep up appearances amongst peers is often a huge cause of stress today. I imagine it was the same in 1892, if not more stressful. Small-town gossip can be brutal, as the newspaper stories proved after the murders, and being an outcast amongst peers is never easy. Other theories as to why Lizzie might have done it involve forbidden love, abuse, and of course, money. Ed McBain, a mystery author, proposed that Lizzie and Bridget might have been caught in a romantic tryst by Mrs. Borden. McBain theorizes that perhaps Mrs. Borden's reaction was so negative that Lizzie, in a fugue state, killed her. When her father came home, Lizzie confessed to the murder, and when he grew furious, Lizzie killed him too. Bridget then might have disposed of the murder weapon later. Another theory speculates that Mr. Borden physically and sexually abused Lizzie for years, and the day of the murder was the day she lashed out against him. There is little evidence to support this theory, but incest and abuse is not a topic that was discussed at the time, and methods for collecting physical evidence of abuse were quite different in 1892. As I read the trial transcripts, the conflicting stories, the utter lack of evidence, doubt grew in my mind, as it had in the jury's minds. There was no indoor plumbing, so even if Lizzie killed her parents naked, how could she have cleaned herself up in the 10 minutes that passed between her father's murder and her call for Bridget? How could she also have cleaned the axe and planted it in the basement, complete with ashes sprinkled over it to look like dust in those minutes? It would have taken a massive amount of planning. It's true she acted strangely from the time of the murder to her trial, but perhaps she was in shock. She was the first person to find the body of her father, and the blood was still wet when she saw him. That scene would bring some people to their knees with fear and sorrow, but cause others to become numb and despondent instead. Her world had been torn apart with her loss. There's no way to predict how someone will act when something like that happens. Also, while Mr. Borden may have been strict and frugal, There is evidence that he cared for his daughters, and they cared for him. He wore a pinky ring given to him by Lizzie at the age of 15. He sold property to his daughters for $1 and then bought it back from them for $3,000. He covered up for Lizzie's shoplifting by paying for everything, saving her from scandal. While these things could have been done to save his own reputation, it still shows some amount of care. It's true Lizzie could have done it, but there was enough doubt to make the jury think twice. They did the lawful thing by acquitting Lizzie Borden. There was not enough evidence to prove beyond any shadow of doubt that she killed her father and stepmother. But if Lizzie Borden didn't do it, who did? There are several theories that suggest other suspects. William Borden was an apple farmer who lived several miles north of Fall River. He was called a cousin, but was suspected to be Mr. Borden's illegitimate son, though the Bordens denied this rumor. William was considered, quote, touched, end quote, which at the time meant mentally non-normative. William constantly ranted about a rich man and wealth that would one day be his while cradling his favorite object, a hatchet. William spent a short time in an insane asylum, but later poisoned and then hung himself in a barn in 1901. His whereabouts were unknown on the day of the murders. Perhaps Mr. Borden's generosity to Abby Borden's relatives instead of his daughters was the last straw for Lizzie's sister Emma. Emma had never referred to Abby as mother, while Lizzie had stopped calling Abby mother and started calling her Mrs. Borden only a few months before the murders, after Andrew Borden bought a share of a house in Fall River for Abby, who let her stepsister live there. Both daughters were infuriated by this, which is when Andrew Borden sold them the piece of property for $1. Still, this perceived favoritism may have been the last straw for Emma, who, having established an alibi at Fairhaven, Massachusetts, about 15 miles away from Fall River, could have returned secretly to commit the murders, and then be back in Fairhaven to receive the telegram informing her of the murders. Or perhaps something about Mr. Borden's business dealings with John Morse, who rarely met with the family after his sister died, but came to stay with them the night before the murders. Something the two men discussed might have triggered Lizzie or John himself to lash out, although John reported never seeing Lizzie while he was there. Despite all these theories, there isn't enough evidence to say who murdered Mr. and Mrs. Borden. If forensic police work and crime scene analysis at the time of the murders had been what they are today, it's very likely this case would have been solved. Because this incident has captivated hundreds since its occurrence, many adaptations of Lizzie's story have been produced in books, television, and film. A novelization of the entire incident was written by Elizabeth Engstrom and titled simply Lizzie Borden. This artistic adaptation is based on the theory of abuse and the totalitarian rule of Andrew Borden as the motive for his death by Lizzie's hand. Another adaptation of Lizzie's story is The Secrets of Lizzie Borden by Brandy Purdy. Purdy creates a literary portrait of the woman behind the unthinkable crime by examining the resentment that must have been felt by Lizzie and Emma toward their father for his frugality, despite their wealth. Another novel that explores this theme is Lizzie Borden, The Girl with the Pansy Pin, written by Michael Thomas Brimbaugh. There's even a series of short stories that imagine Lizzie Borden as a girl detective, written by Richard Behrens. In television and film, there are too many adaptations to count, but several popular ones include The Legend of Lizzie Borden, a 1975 film starring Elizabeth Montgomery, Lizzie Borden Took an Axe, and The Lizzie Borden Chronicles, which both feature Christina Ricci as a more obviously psychotic Lizzie Borden. In 2018, a film called Lizzie came out, starring Kristen Stewart and Chloe Sevigny. This film focused on the theory of a relationship between Lizzie and Bridget, as well as abuse by Andrew Borden. In most media reimaginings of the Lizzie Borden story, Lizzie is guilty, but her reasons seem to justify the murders. The stories try to show what could lead a woman to kill her father and stepmother, and have the viewer or reader somehow still root for her. Still, they assume her guilt. Lizzie Borden, the real person, becomes secondary, as does her possible innocence. What hasn't been explored thoroughly is the very real possibility that someone else killed Mr. and Mrs. Borden. We are captivated by Lizzie Borden. The murders of her father and stepmother to this day remain a gruesome mystery that may never be solved, and Lizzie herself is surrounded by conflicting stories. That is why Lizzie Borden brings out the curiosity in us. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.